I expect all of us are slightly cognitively saturated by this point, but I will try to cover the. I apologize for giving you a first draft paper, but there were various quotes and references which I wanted you to have. So the paper is very much a work in progress, and I have benefited from the discussion so far. I do want to thank Marc Dumas and his secretariat for their organizational efforts and for bringing us all together. My Tillichian dialectical joke as a Canadian is we are truly put the negative before the positive. Canadian is someone who's not an American and not an Englishman. So anyway, anyway, all right. This is my frustration in the last 2 or 3 papers I've given at various Tillich meetings is all this emphasis on ambiguity, fragmentariness, and so forth evaporates the will to take decisive political action in any kind of concerted way. And so, given Tillich's reputation for his involvement in religious socialism, how does one see in his works where this inhibition comes from, and might there be ways of unpacking it? And picking up on some of the themes we've already had, I touch on theonomy as a key. The reason for the inhibitions and so forth, it struck me this time round, having reading volume 3 a little more seriously than I ever did before, to be honest, the extent to which the subject-object dichotomy, the kind of Buberian I, thou, I, it thing, runs through and explains everything. And for Tillich, it's the I, the individual I, who is the decisive, free, finite individual. And that is militating against taking seriously the kind of corporate involvement that the constructivists and deconstructionists are more interested in. I'm going to try to read bits of the paper, and some of it will be redundancies and so forth, but see how we go. Tillich's experience in America was very much colored by the fact that both in New York and at Harvard, the philosophy department he had to deal with was linguistic analytic, which was the training I had. And he saw them as really logical positivists and basically objectivizers. And so the subject-object thing is he's trying to save language and thought from objectivizing human beings. And in this I see he's very much more influenced by Heidegger than I thought at the time when I was his student. And I will hit a quote here somewhere where he calls Bultmann his teacher. So against the linguistic kind of verificationist precision, scientistic way of thinking, he pushes ambiguity and tentativeness and so forth, and the fact that I used to say of Bultmann, it's like a threadless sewing machine. The needle comes up and down vertically, but there's no trace on the linen. And it's a bit the same with Tillich on how the breakthroughs of the spiritual presence hit our what you're getting a historical pointers, not programs. Spiritual presence refers to power for life, including the roots of political power and the power to love God and neighbor. And Tillich's concern was not to separate religion and politics, but to rule out ascribing misplaced ultimacy to specific political institutions and party platforms. His rejection of any post-Kantian espousal of, quote, ethical theism, which neglected completely the divine mystery and majesty, is one of his sentences in Love, Power, and Justice. And the emphasis on majesty and mystery, again, pushes him in the direction of ambiguity rather than precision of statement. For him, a theologically correct linking of religion and politics will give priority attention to the spirited dynamics of religion, but the emphasis on mystery will inhibit saying anything like aux armes, citoyens, anything that will actually rally the troops to man the barricades. An article I published in Harvard Theological Review years ago pointed out on substance in Tillich is a dynamic, and culture comes second. So the religion is the dynamic substance. The culture is a form which gets broken by the next dynamic intrusion. So you're not going to get a strong, steady Platonic view of form. Okay, his revised analyses of Protestant principle and Catholic substance, to me, don't really bear fruit in Volume 3, and I notice a footnote to Charles Fox's remarks in memory of Bill Kraut in the North American Paul Tillich Society Bulletin that Fred edits, that Charles and Bill worked for years trying to get a better version of Volume 3, and eventually University of Chicago went out and didn't do the updated. So I used some references to a couple of sources that are contemporary near the time Tillich died, because I don't think Tillich himself revised the final volume in anything like the way he might have if he'd been a younger, more energetic person. Tillich welcomed, there's one of the important sources I point to, the Journal of Religion, the year Tillich died, brought out a bunch of articles by Bob Shalaman and Lewis Ford and Moody Smith and so forth, and then Tillich has a rejoinder. And so I'm drawing attention to his responses. On the biblical portrait of Jesus the Christ, his response to Lewis Ford is excellent. On that I may say later, but I'll say it right now. One of the reasons positive for Tillich's emphasis on a kind of ambiguity and vagueness is his love of it, or enthusiasm for expressionism in art. And Guernica is the negative example, and so on. But his point was precisely those artists were not doing photographs. What they were, Edvard Munch's The Scream, is giving you a realistic, very realistic sense of what post-World War, the early century in Germany felt like during the war and the Depression and all of that. Expressionism is realistic but not objectivizing. And so the push is to a symbol, not a categorical statement. And the power of the symbol is indeed realistic, but what it's realistic about is evoking the spiritual sense of community, presence, and so forth, which can never be put down in a kind of verifiable set of factual statements. Okay. Now, in response, he welcomes Shalaman's article on the method of correlation, because Shalaman is pointing out a connection of being and doing rather than the process theologians saying you shouldn't talk about being itself, you should talk about becoming. Okay? And then what I'm interested in, apropos of today's session, is what he then says about subjectivity. Tillich deplores the assessments of his exposition of God as being itself in Volume 1, which do not acknowledge his greater emphasis on the subjectivity of being itself in Volume 3. And he declares that while, quote, the whole structure of my doctrine of God starts with the statement that God is being itself, it culminates by speaking of, quote, God as life, which includes subjectivity and objectivity, God as spirit, in which the subjectivity reaches its fulfillment, and God is related in terms of a threefold form of creativity in every moment, on every place of, that is, God as doing, and that's self-integrating, self-creating, self-transcending. So then he adds that he's not a pantheist, but he sees spirit everywhere, but he's not going to allow you to tie it to a form, which is going to give him problems when he gets to Jesus, of course. But his solution to that is going to be Jesus is going to sacrifice the Jesus to the Christ. In Systematics 3, the focus on life culminating in human life sets up a study of history as key to answering the quest for unambiguous meaning. And the kingdom of God is the theological symbol of the where and when of the answer. And this fits to the Socialist Decision book, where he talks about looking at origins and looking at endings, and the culture of a people is in the direction that you get from those, and he's critiquing then the Nazis and the Marxists and pushing for a Christian religious socialist sense of that. And the kingdom of God is the symbol for that ending, but it's never going to be a precise map. It's going to be a symbol. But I had a great thought for this morning, which I'll come to at the end of this, on how we pick up on that idea of the kingdom as symbol. Okay, so the ontological presupposition, wherever self-world relations are at issue, is that the subject side of the subject-object relations is primary. Human beings alone are creaturely subjects who have centered selves and so on. And in the talk of love, the whole thing he stresses about love is love cannot coerce a centered self, and it still be a self it will destroy in that case. He's tending to see governmental power and objectivizing power as destructive of that self. So he's always trying to protect the subjectivity. Kierkegaard's going to win over Hegel here. But Schelling's in the background. But then when I took Tillich's lectures, or sat in on his lectures on Schelling, there were 9 different Schellings, and I was never quite sure which one was the winner. In volume 3, Tillich directly addresses the question, and this is another thing that hit me in light of what I've taught and so forth. Where is the theology of liberation in all of this? What's happened to hope? So in volume 3, Tillich says, why does this presentation in the systematics of the fundamental creation of the divine spirit not add, this is a quote from volume 3, why does it not add hope to faith and love rather than consider hope as the third element of faith, that is, as the anticipatory direction of faith? The answer, he says, his answer, is that if hope were considered systematically and not only homiletically like Paul, as a third creation of the Spirit, its standing in man would be on a par with faith. It would be an independent act of anticipatory expectation whose relation to faith would be ambiguous. It would fall under the attitude of believing that, which is in sharp contrast to the meaning of faith. Hope is either an element of faith or a pre-spiritual work, as love tends to become a spiritual work in his view among Catholics and so forth, and it can't be that. Well, from my point of view, this excuse, and later in volume 3 he also refers to Ernst Bloch's principle of hope and doesn't do any better there from my point of view. But from my point of view, I was brought up as an Anglican that Lutherans, when they say faith, mean what Catholics mean by faith, hope, and love. And there's just a failure of communication. And the other thing is that well, apropos of that, I find all through volume 3 Tillich being very, very Lutheran. Jean-Richard mentioned that earlier, apropos of Simul Justus et Peccator. In all kinds of ways, Tillich's gut reaction is theologically Lutheran, and philosophically on the Schellingian side, and he gets critiqued. This was mentioned a bit in the Adorno exchange, but in other ways, I have another paper in which I address George Lindbeck's critique of Tillich and Cantwell Smith for being experiential expressivists in meaning. Tillich and Smith had classical educations in Greek and Latin, and they learned to define terms in the Kittel Wörterbuch kind of style, as he's very essentialist in his definitions, and I think that controls a lot of these kinds of things. I plain don't see why hope couldn't have been reanalyzed in the light of what he does with creative justice in Love, Power, and Justice. There's glimmers of that in volume 3, but not really. Dynamically, substantive sacramental presencing of spiritual living, Tillich says it, is not incompatible with following divine laws. There are hints of this in volume 3, and here's a quote where Tillich acknowledges, quote, "The judgment against power politics should not be a rejection of power. Where justice is violated, the fight against objectivation of personal subjects is a permanent task of the churches to be carried out by prophetic witness and priestly initiation." This is a rare time where he actually says something positive about priestly initiation. For all this stuff about Catholic substance, it's all Protestant principle, which he calls the self-reforming principle, which he calls the prophetic principle. But here's one time where he actually admits that priestly initiation might help fight objectivation in the world. But then he goes on to qualify immediately his quote, and this is his real position on the whole issue always. Quote, "It is not the function of the churches, the prophetic traditions, or any other to control the political powers and force upon them particular solutions in the name of the kingdom of God." So he's always going to pull back from endorsing any particular political program. He does in volume 3 and in some of the essays that Ron Stone and has edited with the help of Lon and Marianne and so on. He takes on the Quakers who want to enforce pacifism and says you can't do that because then you're legislating individual acts of conscience for a whole people, not of all of whom are Christian. On the other hand, he does say atomic nuclear war is out because that's global suicide. But any sort of narrower position he won't take. Okay, so to the end, his abiding mistrust of theocratic sacramentalism and hierarchical ecclesial authority colored his very Lutheran conception of what constitutes the essence of Catholicism and the virtue of hope. He addresses this in his final, okay. And one of the, I'm on, no, I don't know what page I'm on that, but there's a book which I happened to pick up at a yard sale called Ultimate Concern, it's dialogues Tillich had with the students at Santa Barbara, edited by Mackenzie Brown. And there they ask him about his previous positions, and he affirms his stand, his talk about quasi-religion and so forth. And what he confirms for me is his identification with Bultmann's realized eschatology, as what you're looking for is authentic individual decision. I remark apropos of the book on socialism, he calls it the socialist decision, not the socialist agenda. The focus is on individual decision, okay. So in his response to questions about his religious socialism in the past and recent critiques of modern quasi-religions, Tillich underscores for the students his theistic humanism, specifically noting, quote, the quasi-religion of liberal humanistic tradition, which is somehow politically expressed in the American Constitution and philosophically expressed in people like the German classical philosophers and their critics, the people he identified with. Then he adds, quote, I am also a proponent of the Christian New Testament tradition of my great teacher, Rudolf Bultmann. And I don't remember being told that he thought of himself as a student of Bultmann before. I think what he's trying to do is identify with that realized eschatology, existentialist response to the kerygma. And what the kerygma culminates in for Tillich, as Bob Schalman wrote in the paper we had at Laval years ago, the cross is the symbol of symbols. In an article I have coming out in the Toronto Journal of Theology, I compared Tillich here with Archbishop William Temple in England, whose unit is not the individual but the family, and Temple is also a religious socialist, but he gets out of that an agenda for equal hours of work, weekends off, homes for orphans, all kinds of political agendas that are part of, because his center is not the deciding existential authentic individual, his center is the family in the commonwealth of value, which is God's sacramental universe. Okay, in this paper I'm supplementing what I'm getting out of volume 3 with references to the Journal of Religion thing with the Schalman article and that Santa Barbara dialogue. And I see very much then that background when he comes to talk about theonomy. And theonomy is a term he keeps from his religious socialist days up until the last. He's a little bit embarrassed about the fact that nomos, from a Lutheran, has legalistic connotations. But he thinks he can, the kingdom of God is a dream of theonomous culture, which you're never ever going to fully realize, but you're still going to try to work for. He says, well, you can kind of protect from the legalism that the Lutheran doesn't want to have and sees in the Catholic hierarchical setup, because that isn't theonomy, that's heteronomy. And the background debate is ethicists talking heteronomy, autonomy, and theonomy is his invention, which I've only ever heard one or two other people. I heard a Bartian using it recently, but it's not a term that's picked up and been run with much. I think theonomy is a very Augustinian idea. It fits the kind of city of God image of, so the Augustinian Lutheran tradition is coming up here. Okay. Running through all his expositions then are this theme of theonomy as theonomous humanism and the subject-object structure, which I think colors a lot of things. So we're working with hindsight, right? So it's a little bit not fair to blame Tillich for not giving us the politics we would like him to have on sex or anything else. Incidentally, on the sex thing, I meant to throw in, this is a red herring. Gordon Allport was a colleague of Tillich's at Harvard, wrote a book called The Individual and His Religion, pointed out you can be mature in one area of your life and immature in another. So the question is, was Tillich a 15-year-old on sex and a 80-year-old on theology? Or was he, in fact, mature all the way through on I think he was getting to at least maybe 35 years old on sex by the time he died. My mother and Hannah were friends, so they used to compare notes on how impossible it was to live with an ex-army chaplain. That's another point I have at the end quote. I quote the Tillich says to Charlemagne, the last part of that essay, the one thing he is always unqualified about is that you cannot settle for nothingness, non-being. Being overcomes being. And I think that came out of his trauma in the World War I, where he had what would now be called a post-traumatic stress disorder breakdown. And all of this kind of stuff, McKinnon's pious talk about bourgeois ethic and so on, just doesn't come close to the world that Tillich and those guys had to live through in the defeat of Germany. But that doesn't justify too much, except to say that at that point, Tillich is being unqualified, unambiguous, and he's saying being is prior to non-being. He always sees non-being as a kind of negation of the being. But the being he's talking about is the dynamic spiritual presence, not an objectified, formalistic system. Now, people like Daphne Hampson, the feminist in England, dismissed Tillich as they just see theonomy as a code word for disguised heteronomy, but I think they just don't get God. and possibly Adorno has that same problem in terms of what being itself is in this dynamic sense. Now, one puzzle to me, how are we doing for time?
We're doing well.
Okay. One puzzle for me is why in his later writing, Tillich doesn't relate his account of theonomy more directly to his early conception of political principle. In the Socialist Decision against Platonizing references to eternal forms and unchanging structures, he distinguishes between the essences of things in the world and principles which characterize historic eras. Principles, he says, name the intellectual dimension and conceptual presupposition of current praxis. The word principle, he writes, is used to refer to the summarizing characterizations of a political group without necessarily encompassing every detail of their corporate existence. So for Germany in the 1930s, he talks about the bourgeois principle and the socialist principle and so on. By the time you get to volume 3, principle, it's unusual for Tillich not to use the word very precisely in a kind of essentialistic definitional way, but principle is just a loose word that kind of floats around there. So he drops principle, and instead, you won't find it in the index, he uses vocational consciousness. And vocation, again, is a huge Lutheran concept. Vocational consciousness for him is people, and this came up a bit earlier too. Tillich says individuals don't have histories, they have biographies, but history-bearing groups are groups of individuals who decide to follow a leader, and their movement gets called, in terms of Lincoln or Marx or Caesar or Jesus or whatever. So you name the individual, but it's a group dynamic that you're talking about. Okay. At this point, he stops using principles. He doesn't use principles as a technical term. He shifts to vocational consciousness, and I sort of wonder why. Because I kind of like the idea of using principle for the conceptual, theoretical side of praxis as a way to pick out, what would be the principles. And in Love and Justice, he does talk about that. He has a whole section, love is the principle of justice, and then he moves to principles of justice, and he talks about equality, fraternity, and so on. So there, he's using the word, but not in the technical sense the way he does elsewhere. As Marianne mentioned about in the Love, Power, and Justice thing, again, this fits the subject-object bit, right? Because distributive, retributive, tributive justice is talking about who gets what. Any of us who have young children, the first thing the kids learn to say is, that's not fair, she got more than me, ice cream on the whatever. There's a sense of fairness and justice and shares that's tributive, distributive, and creative justice is God acknowledging the inequalities, but then pushing towards a creative transformation in a way that will bring the equality in the future, which isn't here now. So the idea of transforming creative justice, I gave a paper on this way back in wherever it was in Ohio that time we met. He anticipates Archbishop Tutu and the whole reconciliation thing on that topic, but he doesn't do it in Volume 3. So that's where he could have picked up and run with it, and if he had been picked up. Tillich's example of justice, and I make this point, the prophetic tradition in the Bible, he calls the Protestant principle the prophetic principle, that the prophets included Moses, if you ask a Jewish colleague, and Moses leads us into Exodus out of slavery. The prophets are speaking in a whole lot more than just Isaiah and Elijah on this, okay? His example of the just ones in the biblical tradition are the Tzaddikim, who obey God, the source of the law, with actions that culminate in realizing forgiveness. And he remarks that if you think about forgiveness, it's actually a very violation of justice present in favor of a future justice. So there are justices and levels of justice and so forth. Anyway, I suggest that the creative justice thing is something that I regret he didn't get to pick up and run with. I just covered a few pages of whatever. So the accent in history for Tillich is always on authentic individual decision. Even this example of the Tzaddikim are individuals, it's not. Whereas the William Temple kind of Catholic thing, the incarnation is the universalizing of the new Israel as a judgment on fallen history, and an implementation, a sacramental, outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual actual history. So there's a whole different dynamic there. Tillich says the question who determines historical processes, the great individuals or the masses, can't really be decided. The data just isn't there. Dialectics, which is a key word for Tillich, is always yes, no. The issue is whether it's a Kierkegaardian yes, no on faith, or it's not a Hegelian yes, no, but and it's not a Marxist, but it's more than just individuals. Kierkegaard. Dialectics does not mean for Tillich settling for some neutral middle ground. So it doesn't mean you go to the wishy-washy middle. His example in the case of just war, for instance, as between the pacifists and the militarists, is the American Civil War, which is a relatively just war involving compulsion and all the things that you say is anti-love, but on the other hand, it's for the sake of a future love, which is going to be greater and so forth. So he allows for just war, and he allows for vocations among religious people to implement that kind of thing. Skipping right, I think I'll just come to the last thought I had apropos of this morning. So where are we left with if all of our symbols are sort of ambiguous and the realizing of spiritual presence is always sort of fragmentary and zips out of your fingers before, like water running through your hands? I was reminded by something someone said this morning apropos of the religious socialist thing. Remember, for Tillich, a symbol is a symbol. You can't invent a symbol. It's something that participates in the reality of the world you're living in. It's part of the culture. And so he points in volume 3 or 4 or wherever it is, the fact that kingdom has political connotations. So if we were to run a little further than Tillich does with unpacking the political sense of kingdom, we might get to the voice, making that the church is there to be a voice for the voiceless, having an option for the poor, some of the things the liberation theologians advocated and included as part of the gospel, which he wouldn't have because he would say, oh, never, you might be idolatrous, you might be, don't make a finite infinite and so forth. So the fact that a symbol has its feet on the ground and its head in the air, so to speak, I think if it were unpacked, and there's a little bit of this when he talks about the kingdom, that it's analogous to the new being idea of overcoming the split between essence and existence and moving towards essentialization in the Christology book. But that overcoming the split between essence and existence and essentializing, which is sort of cashing in your potentialities is still with Tillich, to my mind, a Lutheran individualistic kind of thing. And if it could be more of a corporate collective thing, then there would be a political agenda, not necessarily for vote for the PQ next time at the Quebec election or anything, but rather whose principles of all the different parties are actually going to improve the environment, going to allow equality between genders, or give a place and education for the poor, and those kinds of things. I see those as parts of decisions, not just for individuals, but for communities who are the history-bearing groups. So I think the symbol of the kingdom of God could be unpacked more than it is in Volume 3. Thank you.